Before I get started, I'm conducting a subscription and share drive. That being the case, don't forget to subscribe to this channel if you want to learn more about that thing in your head, not the nagging thoughts about all the things that you did wrong in life, but your brain. I frequently take recommendations from my subscribers about the content they want to learn about the most. As such, I often get requests to address consciousness, or at least explain how consciousness arises from the brain. So many complications exist with this particular topic, and I've been putting it off a bit. However, I finally buckled down and put this one up for a vote on my Patreon page, linked in the description box below, and without fail, they voted on consciousness, because my patrons love torturing me. So today, on Brief Brain Facts...
Okay, let me step in here.
Besativity, what are you doing here?
Giving some insight on the philosophical aspect of consciousness. After all, philosophy is the field where the discussion began in the Western world, and it looks like you have brain issues.
Hey. Well, you're not wrong. Okay, fine. I can certainly use the help.
So today on Brief Brain Facts,
let's discuss the neuroscience,
neurophilosophy
of consciousness. Consciousness is a difficult concept to grasp, but from a neuroscientific point of view, consciousness may be defined as the mental awareness of sensations, perceptions, memories, and feelings. Interestingly, this definition does include altered consciousness states, such as sleeping. This is why we make a distinction between consciousness and waking consciousness, which is the state of being lucid or clear and alert, while aware of sensations, perceptions, memories, and feelings. As you can probably guess, defining consciousness is no easy task.
Amanda, you're right. In fact, the best that philosophy has done is define consciousness as an association of concepts such as perception, awareness, sensations, cognitive capacities, and the utilization of those capacities.
So what you're saying here is that consciousness in philosophical terms is best described as the utilization of a combination of awareness, sensations, perceptions, and cognition?
Well, yes, but there's a caveat. Even defining it this way is problematic because it doesn't accurately define the phenomenon as a whole.
Oh yeah? How so?
Well, in order to understand where we're at today regarding our current understanding of consciousness, we have to understand where we began.
That makes sense to me.
Once upon a time, there was the beginning of philosophy, and the debate about consciousness began, but it didn't really take the form that we know it as today until about 1641 with René Descartes. You know, the guy known for saying, "I think, therefore I am." Descartes' concept of consciousness was that it took the form of an immaterial mind separate from the physical brain.
Oh, okay, this is where the emergence of the mind-brain dichotomy originated.
Exactly. This is known as Cartesian dualism. However, the philosopher Daniel Dennett, in 1991, in his book Consciousness Explained, rebuked this type of dualism, stating that it would violate the law of conservation of energy. The law states that energy cannot be created or destroyed, so an immaterial mind having a physical effect on a material object, such as the brain, would require energy to be created from nothing. However, it wasn't until 1690 when the actual term consciousness made its first appearance, in which John Locke and other British empiricists formulated their materialist conception of consciousness. Here, consciousness is seen simply as sensory receptors, transmitting sensory information from the external world to the brain, which would then take that information to create an imaginary inner world.
So here I'm seeing an explanation for how our sensory information is created into our perception of said sensory information.
Well, that's where Immanuel Kant in the 1780s made a clear distinction between the objective world, or noumena, and the subjective conscious experience, or things as they appear to be, which he called phenomena. The philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel was the first to explore consciousness in a social context. Hegel believed that consciousness would only manifest and develop after the dialectical interaction and recognition of the other.
The other being other people?
Right, and this was further explored by such figures as Karl Marx and Friedrich Nietzsche, who went on to inspire even more followers. But let's switch gears and talk about Daniel Dennett, a leading thinker in current neurophilosophy. Dennett posits that certain environmental pressures lead to the development of a nervous system.
That's essentially true. Our nervous system exists due to the pressures in early environments that require things like reflexes and sensations.
Exactly. Pressures led to certain abilities like detecting threat, perceiving color, facilitating social relationships, etc., etc. Dennett argues that through the accumulation of these capacities, a sense of awareness and self-control was developed. He argues that consciousness then became an incidental, emergent property of adaptations that work together to perpetuate life. As an analogy, brain cells in a brain are similar to that of termites in a termite colony.
You mean that individual termites experience their role in the colony, but are completely ignorant of the larger results of their actions.
Exactly. Each termite,
or brain cell,
has a role to play, and each one plays their role, like following chemical trails,
or producing neurotransmitters,
wherein they participate in building the entire colony without ever knowing that the colony itself acts as one cohesive unit from the perspective of the outside world.
That's an excellent analogy.
Thank you, but I didn't make it. Some guy with a beard did. Speaking of, Dennett described consciousness as a complex set of memes, more or less meme effects in brains, that can be best understood as the operation of a von Neumann-esque virtual machine.
Wait, what? Memes? These are memes, right?
Oh, sorry. No, not those. He meant memes as the cultural accumulations of information that replicate like genes. In this context, memes are like the ideas in culture that stay alive by changing in culture while culture changes. Von Neumann, influenced by Alan Turing, designed the first computer based on similar ideas on processing information. Hence the reason why Dennett described consciousness as von Neumann-esque.
Okay, let's summarize. According to Dennett, consciousness is the accumulation of cultural ideas compiled together through a network of brain cells that act on their own, like termites in a colony, but end up creating their own complex world without any given cell knowing what the other is doing.
That's basically right.
Okay, just one issue. Our brains are much more complex than a computer. Unlike computers, which process things one at a time, our brain cells act in a network and process information in more of a three-dimensional way. Binary communication seen in computers is uncountably less complex than how our brains operate.
It's a fair criticism. Dennett compares our brains to a complex computer, but computers in no way have the same processing and networking power as our brains.
Also, a lot of what we perceive consciously is processed unconsciously. Our consciousness, as we may envision it here, is highly limited compared to all the inputs we receive. It's as if we're only aware of the top of that termite hill and can't see any of the inner workings.
Good point. The philosopher Patricia Churchland said the same when describing how eye movement signals are widely dispersed across the brain, and we're not always consciously aware of that.
I might be inclined to agree with her, but I think the philosophers are on the right track.
Well, I may have overstayed my welcome.
No, stay for a bit. Let's dig into the brain side. So you can probably see why the field of neuroscience was unwilling to tackle the issue of consciousness. It's not only complicated to define, but the consciousness we often envision is based on subjective experience.
So you're saying that scientists weren't willing to tackle what philosophers had been trying to address for thousands of years.
That's exactly what I'm saying. And it wasn't until about the last 30 years or so that neuroscience began addressing the topic of consciousness, as it was deemed too subjective, belonging to the world of philosophy, not science, which researchers did note to be a paradox, as the widespread interest in the brain surely stems much from its unique ability to generate our conscious experience.
Yeah, that brain scientists were avoiding something that even philosophers would concede arises from the brain is actually quite fascinating.
Oh, well, don't worry. The field of neuroscience finally came around, and the field as a whole is quite young. Now that neuroscientists have begun tackling the issue, the first step is defining what's being measured. There has to be an agreed-upon starting place. You know, because science.
No arguments from me.
Thus, consciousness is best defined as a subjective experience of perceptions, thoughts, imagery, and even dreams that encompass two components. The first part being level-based. This part accounts for a wakeful or resting consciousness and is controlled by the brainstem and the basal forebrain. Regarding the second component, researchers point towards thalamocortical areas giving rise to this component, the content part of consciousness.
For neuroscientists, Consciousness is defined nearly in the exact same way that I had initially defined it. You know, they might have actually gone a couple of steps further, and they may be attempting to address those aspects of the philosophical definition that may fall short, such as the subjective experiences in nature and the level component and the content component.
Exactly, you got it.
That's good and all, but how do you go from this agreed upon definition to measuring consciousness?
Bisativity, that's an excellent question. Yes, well, scientists have examined the neural correlates of consciousness in two distinct ways. The first way in which researchers attempt to understand consciousness is by examining the content-specific neural correlates of consciousness, meaning they test the way in which a specific topic, such as facial recognition and processing, elicit a specific brain response. The second way in which scientists look at consciousness is by examining the entire process in the brain that may give rise to our understanding of consciousness. In this case, scientists investigate the neural correlates of consciousness in its entirety without specific consideration of content. In doing so, researchers have discovered a few key things pertaining to content-specific consciousness and even discerning what may be the neural signals of waking consciousness as a state of awareness. First, regarding content consciousness, a number of studies have dismantled the idea of heavy involvement of the prefrontal cortex.
So the prefrontal cortex used to be where scientists thought that consciousness was held?
Sort of. You see, it was assumed that the prefrontal cortex played an essential role in content-specific consciousness. Instead, what researchers have found is heavy engagement of posterior regions of the brain, specifically the parietal, temporal, and occipital lobes. Regarding overall consciousness, a couple of prominent hypotheses have emerged: the Integrated Information Theory of Consciousness, or IIT, and the Global Neuronal Workspace Hypothesis, or GWT. IIT postulates that instead of considering the neural correlates that may give rise to consciousness, one must consider the type and levels of consciousness that may emerge given certain conditions and circumstances.
Well, that sounds a lot like dualism with the whole difference between the mind and the brain.
Honestly, this hypothesis is insufficient from a scientific point of view, as far as I can tell. It still maintains room for the mind-brain dichotomy. On the other hand, GWT suggests that access to our subjective experience of consciousness is the global amplification of a signal that is broadcasted to many different areas in the brain that are seemingly unconnected with each other. Thus, consciousness is the result of time-dependent neuronal activity across multiple distant brain regions, and certain signals or sets of information are increased, resulting in our subjective experience of consciousness.
I'm sure everyone can agree that consciousness is a completely subjective experience.
Agreed. We all experience consciousness differently, though research seems to indicate that there are still similarities in the brain across the population. In a recent large-scale study published in 2019, researchers investigated the neurocorrelates of consciousness by examining both conscious, alert and aware, and unconscious human brains. The researchers discovered the emergence of two distinct patterns of brain activity. The first was a complex pattern characterized in part by opposites. When one area was active, other areas showed signs of reduced activity. However, these complex patterns of activations were not connected via an anatomical structure. The only relationship they shared was that they were active at the same time. The second activation pattern was simpler, in that it was constrained by brain area and structure. Interestingly, the brains of those who were fully conscious spent more time exhibiting the complex pattern of brain activity. In contrast, participants who were diagnosed with unresponsive wakefulness syndrome showed more instances of the simple brain activation pattern. Notably, these unresponsive patients did show brief instances of the complex activation pattern. As such, if these patterns do represent varying degrees of consciousness, researchers propose that when unresponsive patients show more complex brain activity, it may be an opportunity for communication to occur with these patients.
Hold on a second. You're saying that those patients may be conscious during that time?
Well, that's a big maybe. We don't know for certain. However, researchers noted that these patterns can be externally manipulated. This may be a non-invasive avenue for making unresponsive patients responsive. From a neuroscience perspective, based on the evidence currently available, consciousness may arise from time-dependent neuronal activation within various anatomically unrelated brain regions. However, scientific research centered around consciousness is still in its early stages, and many limitations exist. One such limitation is defining an arguably subjective experience objectively. While the question of consciousness has been a constant within the field of philosophy, more recently, neuroscientists have aimed to define it scientifically and measure it to understand how the brain may give rise to consciousness.
Ultimately, neurophilosophy has helped define consciousness from a philosophical perspective and should be credited with hundreds of years of discussion on the topic.
And neuroscience is just in the beginning stages of defining how consciousness happens in our brains. Finding that answer may take some time, but if we know anything about scientific research, we're far from ending our search. I want to thank Activity for contributing to this episode of Brief Brain Facts, and don't forget to check out his channel. The link is in the description box below. Of course, if you like what you saw, don't forget to subscribe to my channel and give this video a thumbs up. Also, if you want to support the show, any little bit goes a long way, so head on over to my Patreon page and become a member. As always, thank you for watching.